This is the story of Dan Mitrione. The US government called him a hero. Frank Sinatra sang at his memorial. Recently declassified CIA records tell a different story. A man who helped build a systematic program of pain across Latin America in the 60s. But to understand how a mid-level bureaucrat became a key operator in that system, you have to start somewhere else. In a US military classroom. A student raises his hand. On his desk, a translated Soviet interrogation manual, the airplane ride, the cold hot water treatment, a jeweler's vise designed to crush a man's testicles. He looks up at the instructor. "Are you teaching us to use these methods?" The instructor pauses. Then he smiles. The mothers of America wouldn't approve. A beat, then the wink, and the line that explains everything. "We will deny that any such thing is taught or intended." The curriculum was never secret. The denial was the curriculum. This wasn't one rogue instructor in one rogue classroom. The same course ran under different names across multiple service branches. The Army called it countermeasures to hostile interrogation. The Navy ran it at schools in San Diego and Maine under survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. The naming conventions changed. The wink did not. What Sergeant Lacey delivered that day wasn't an improvised remark. It was institutional policy, wearing the face of a joke, deniability engineered directly into the moment of instruction, accountability designed out of the system before the first student ever sat down. The translated Soviet manuals served two functions simultaneously. They provided technical instruction on precise methods of physical and psychological destruction, and they provided cover. The official position, if anyone ever asked, was that American personnel were studying enemy techniques, not building an American torture curriculum. The gap between those two statements was exactly the width of Lacey's grin. This video traces something that moved beyond that classroom. It traces how a police trainer taught these methods across South America, not as a freelancer, not as a criminal, but as a salaried employee of the United States government, operating inside a structured program that spanned countries, rotated personnel, and processed human beings through ideological indoctrination and technical brutality at industrial scale. The Office of Public Safety, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Agency for International Development. These were not separate operations running in parallel. They were the same machine wearing different nameplates. The classroom is where the logic begins. Lacey's wink is where you see it clearly. A system that knew exactly what it was doing, built its own deniability in from the start, and then exported that knowledge southward, country by country, police station by police station. The man who would carry this curriculum out of the classroom and into the police stations of South America had a name, a family, and a government salary. His name was Dan Mitrione, and the US had already sent him to Brazil. After Cuba fell to Castro in 1959, Washington made a decision that would define the next 2 decades of Latin American history. The Kennedy administration launched what it called a dual program, intensive counterinsurgency training for police and military forces across the hemisphere, paired with nominal support for democratization and social reform. The two objectives were structurally incompatible from the first day. Wherever the trained forces took root, democracy withered. Reform became a threat to be neutralized. The counterinsurgency side of the equation always won. Brazil made that visible in 1964. A military coup, backed by the United States, replaced the elected government and installed a dictatorship that immediately announced a program of moral rehabilitation. The language was bureaucratic. What it described was systematic. Peasant homes burned, priests brutalized, dissidents disappeared into facilities where no legal mechanism could reach them. Death squads operated with the tacit authorization of a state now underwritten by American dollars and American institutional support. The apparatus that made this possible had three interlocking pillars. The Office of Public Safety provided the training infrastructure and the personnel. The CIA provided intelligence integration and ideological direction. The Agency for International Development provided the funding architecture that made the entire operation legible to congressional oversight as foreign aid. Together, they constructed something that looked, from a distance, like a police modernization program. Up close, it was something else entirely. Dan Mitrione arrived in Brazil in the 1960s under the Office of Public Safety, a man with a law enforcement background and a government salary and the unremarkable appearance of a mid-level bureaucrat. What he helped construct was not unremarkable. By 1969, the Office of Public Safety had established an entire national police force and trained over 100,000 officers inside Brazil alone. Another 523 were brought to the United States for advanced instruction. 100,000. That number deserves a moment of stillness. This was not a covert program operating in shadows. It was an industrial assembly line. Men processed, certified, and returned to their cities carrying a curriculum. Approximately 1/3 of every academy day was devoted to lectures on the communist menace. The remaining time covered techniques. The techniques had names, they had procedures. They were taught, practiced, and replicated. Electric shocks, the Pao de Arara, the parrot's perch, where victims were suspended upside down from a rod, while electric current was applied to their most sensitive extremities. Burning petrol-soaked reeds inserted into the bodies of people held in that suspended position. Pregnant women brought into interrogation rooms and forced to watch their husbands broken. Wives stripped and hung naked beside their husbands, given electric shocks to their sexual organs. These were not improvised cruelties born of battlefield rage. They were systematized, they were transferable. They were taught by men with government paychecks to men who would train other men, creating a self-sustaining apparatus of repression that required minimal ongoing American presence to keep operating. That was the force multiplier model. A small cadre of American advisors, a massive indigenous infrastructure of pain. The Americans could step back and the machine would run itself. 100,000 trained officers meant the machine would run for a generation. Internal assessments within the US government acknowledged what the program actually was. Officials reviewed the close American identification with an explicitly authoritarian regime and weighed the risks. Their conclusion, preserved in the documentary record, was that the possible disadvantages of that association were not particularly important. The authoritarian nature of the partnership was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be managed. Mitrione was not a rogue actor inside this system. He was a career professional executing a program that had been designed, funded, and institutionally supported at every level. The torture was not a side effect. It was the point. When Mitrione had finished his work in Brazil, the Office of Public Safety did not retire him. They sent him to Uruguay. This was not coincidence. This was design. The Office of Public Safety operated on a rotation model. Experienced trainers moved between countries, carrying proven methods across borders, replicating the apparatus wherever Washington decided it was needed. Brazil had been the proving ground. Uruguay was the next deployment. The curriculum traveled with him. He arrived as the campaign against the Tupamaros urban guerrillas was intensifying. The Tupamaros had emerged from a society where legal democratic channels were being systematically closed. Political opposition was marginalized. Reform was blocked at every turn. The guerrilla movement was not born in a vacuum. It was born in a country where every legitimate avenue of dissent was being methodically dismantled. The CIA was already present, advising counterinsurgency operations, embedding itself in the security architecture before Mitrione ever crossed the border. What he brought with him was the same curriculum, the same ideological framing. 1/3 of every training day devoted to lectures on the communist menace, the rest to techniques that had already broken bodies in Brazilian detention cells. Electric shocks, the Pao de Arara, the burning reeds, the systematic use of family members as instruments of pressure. These were not improvised cruelties. They were a transferable program, and Mitrione was the man who transferred them. The Uruguayan security forces taking shape under his instruction were becoming something the country had no precedent for: systematic, ideologically coherent, technically proficient in the application of suffering. And the people on the receiving end of what those forces did were drawing their own conclusions about what came next. The security environment Mitrione had spent years constructing was now producing exactly the kind of radicalized opposition it claimed to be preventing. And in 1970, that opposition came for him directly. In July of that year, the Tupamaros kidnapped Dan Mitrione off the streets of Montevideo. The causal chain was not complicated, even if the official response worked hard to obscure it. A security apparatus built on systematic torture had eliminated every legal avenue of dissent available to Uruguayan citizens. Democratic governance had been hollowed out from inside, with US-trained forces ensuring that reform remained impossible and that anyone who pushed for it risked the Pao de Arara, the electric current, the burning reed. What the apparatus produced, predictably, was people with nothing left to lose. The US government mourned Mitrione as a fallen public servant. The official statements described a dedicated professional, a family man, a victim of terrorist violence. What they omitted was the architecture he had built, the techniques he had transferred from Brazil to Uruguay, and the direct relationship between systematic state brutality and the radicalization of armed opposition. The mourning was genuine. The framing was a fiction. The Tupamaros demanded the release of political prisoners. The Uruguayan government refused. In August 1970, they killed him. His body was found in the back seat of a stolen car. The campaign against the Tupamaros continued until 1973. It ended not with the restoration of democratic governance or the vindication of the security strategy, but with the replacement of Uruguay's elected government by a US-backed military regime. The pattern that had run through Guatemala, through Brazil, through country after country across the hemisphere, completed itself in Uruguay exactly as it had everywhere else. The torture apparatus built to protect democracy had consumed it. Mitrione was buried in Richmond, Indiana, with full honors. President Nixon sent a personal representative. Frank Sinatra and Jerry Lewis organized a benefit concert for his family. The men he had trained were still at work. The recently declassified assessments that explain what Mitrione actually built and who authorized it don't read like exposés. They read like administrative paperwork. That is what makes them devastating. Officials explicitly acknowledged the authoritarian nature of their partner regimes. They weighed the disadvantages of close identification with governments that tortured pregnant women and hung wives naked beside their husbands and applied electric current to their bodies. And they concluded, in measured bureaucratic language, that those disadvantages were not seen as particularly important. This wasn't a rogue operation. It wasn't a policy accident. It was a decision, made clearly by people who understood exactly what they were authorizing. The institutional deception was designed in from the beginning. The Army called it countermeasures to hostile interrogation. The Navy ran its version under survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. The Soviet interrogation manuals distributed as classroom materials gave every instructor the same answer when questioned: "We are studying enemy techniques." The cover names, the translated manuals, the rotating course titles across different branches and different facilities, none of it was confusion. It was architecture. Plausible deniability, engineered at the structural level so that no single person, no single classroom, no single course name could ever be made to bear the full weight of what the program actually was. And the program was everywhere. Brazil was the largest operation, but it wasn't the only one. Across the hemisphere, the CIA, the Office of Public Safety, and the Agency for International Development combined to build the same apparatus in different national uniforms. Over 100,000 policemen trained inside Brazil alone. Hundreds more brought to the United States for advanced instruction. Experienced trainers like Mitrione rotated between countries, carrying proven methods across borders, replicating what worked. The torture apparatus wasn't a collection of isolated national programs. It was a single curriculum applied at scale across a continent. Congress shut down the Office of Public Safety in 1974 under the Foreign Assistance Act. But the regimes the program had built didn't end with it. The police forces trained by the Office of Public Safety remained. The techniques refined in those classrooms remained. The apparatus outlived the agency that constructed it, which was, in a certain sense, exactly how it was designed to work. Build it deep enough into local institutions, and it sustains itself. You don't need the Americans in the room anymore. Sergeant Lacey told his students the Mothers of America wouldn't approve. He was right. But the Mothers of America were never supposed to find out. That was always the point. The curriculum was never secret. The denial was.